3, 2, 1.
Buddhism. Religion and philosophy that developed from the teachings of the Buddha, a teacher who lived in northern India between the mid-6th and mid-4th centuries BCE. Spreading from India to Central and Southeast Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, Buddhism has played a central role in the spiritual, cultural, and social life of Asia. And, beginning in the 20th century, it spread to the West. Ancient Buddhist scripture and doctrine developed in several closely related literary languages of ancient India, especially in Pali and Sanskrit. Buddhism arose in northeastern India, sometime between the late 6th century and the early 4th century BCE, a period of great social change and intense religious activity. There is disagreement among scholars about the dates of the Buddha's birth and death. Many modern scholars believe that the historical Buddha lived from about 563 to about 483 BCE. Many others believe that he lived about 100 years later. At this time in India, there was much discontent with Brahmanic sacrifice and ritual. In northwestern India, there were ascetics who tried to create a more personal and spiritual religious experience than that found in the Vedas. In the literature that grew out of this movement, the Upanishads, a new emphasis on renunciation and transcendental knowledge can be found. Northeastern India, which was less influenced by Vedic tradition, became the breeding ground of many new sects. Society in this area was troubled by the breakdown of tribal unity and the expansion of several petty kingdoms. Religiously, this was a time of doubt, turmoil, and experimentation. Buddhism, like many of the sects that developed in northeastern India at the time, was constituted by the presence of a charismatic teacher, by the teachings this leader promulgated, and by a community of adherents that was often made up of renunciant members and lay supporters. In the case of Buddhism, this pattern is reflected in the Triratna, the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. In the centuries following the founder's death, Buddhism developed into directions represented by two different groups. One was called the Hinayana, a term given to it by its Buddhist opponents, this more conservative group, which included what is now called the Theravada community, compiled versions of the Buddha's teachings that had been preserved in collections, called the Sutta Pitaka and the Vinaya Pitaka, and retained them as normative. The other major group, which calls itself the Mahayana, recognized the authority of other teachings that, from the group's point of view, made salvation available to a greater number of people. These supposedly more advanced teachings were expressed in sutras that the Buddha purportedly made available only to his more advanced disciples.
The life of the Buddha.
The teacher known as the Buddha lived in northern India sometime between the mid-6th and the mid-4th centuries, before the Common Era. In ancient India, the title Buddha referred to an enlightened being who has awakened from the sleep of ignorance and achieved freedom from suffering. According to the various traditions of Buddhism, Buddhas have existed in the past and will exist in the future. Some Buddhists believe that there is only one Buddha for each historical age. Others that all beings will become Buddhas because they possess the Buddha nature. The historical figure referred to as the Buddha was born on the northern edge of the Ganges River Basin, an area on the periphery of the ancient civilization of North India, in what is today as southern Nepal. He is said to have lived for 80 years. His family name was Gautama, and his given name was Siddhartha or Siddhartha. He is frequently called Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya clan. In Buddhist texts, he is most commonly addressed as Bhagavat, and he refers to himself as the Tathagata, which can mean both one who has thus come and one who has thus gone. Information about his life derives largely from Buddhist texts. the earliest of which were produced shortly before the beginning of the Common Era, and thus several centuries after his death. According to the traditional accounts, however, the Buddha was born into the ruling Shakya clan and was a member of the Kshatriya, or warrior, caste. His mother, Mahamaya, dreamt one night that an elephant entered her womb, and 10 lunar months later, while she was strolling in the garden of Lumbini, her son emerged from under her right arm. His early life was one of luxury and comfort, and his father protected him from exposure to the ills of the world, including old age, sickness, and death. At age 16, he married the princess Yashodhara, who would eventually bear him a son. At 29, however, the prince had a profound experience when he first observed the suffering of the world. While on chariot rides outside the palace, he resolved then to renounce his wealth and family and live the life of an ascetic. During the next 6 years, he practiced meditation with several teachers and then, with 5 companions, undertook a life of extreme self-mortification. One day, while bathing in a river, he fainted from weakness and therefore concluded that mortification was not the path to liberation from suffering. Abandoning the life of extreme asceticism, the prince sat in meditation under a tree and received enlightenment, sometimes identified with understanding the Four Noble Truths. For the next 45 years, the Buddha spread his message throughout northeastern India, established orders of monks and nuns, and received the patronage of kings and merchants. At the age of 80, he became seriously ill. He then met with his disciples for the last time to impart his final instructions, and passed into nirvana. His body was then cremated and the relics distributed, and enshrined in stupas, funerary monuments that usually contained relics, where they would be venerated.